All right, welcome back. It is 3:59 on my clock, so we'll give folks a couple extra minutes. I tried to do the screen share again. It looks like it's always going to kick you off when you try to switch back to video. So we'll keep messing with it. We'll try to figure it out. But I see a couple eyeballs on the screen. I believe I've shared it over at my site. So hopefully we'll see the audience grow a little bit. Okay, I think I'm situated on my end, so we'll jump into it and answer some questions today. So welcome back to another Open Door at 4. It is 4 o'clock, so we're going to jump into the questions today. All right, so let's see what we have. Question number 1. Why do ministers want to pretend the abuse never happened? Why do ministers want to pretend the abuse never happened? So I don't know really if pastors and ministers are pretending. I don't know if it's that. It's probably a combination of some other things. I mean, I guess there may be some folks out there, we have to be honest, who genuinely see abuse and they turn a blind eye. I think we've seen some of that in recent days. On occasion, that's wicked, evil. It should be called out immediately. So if anyone's pretending, I mean, if they're turning a blind eye purposefully to abuse, then that's a major, major problem, and we should call that out. And so that's something that should happen immediately. I think what's more than likely happening most of the time, and of course I don't know the questioner's specific instance or situation, but what's happening most of the time are actions being taken out of ignorance, fear. Those are kind of the common things that are happening. So a lot of times pastors mutualize abuse. That's much more likely than just pretending. They'll mutualize abuse by making it a marriage problem. They will minimize abuse. They'll join the abuser in minimizing the problem by saying it's not that big of a deal, or perhaps they blame. So they might join in kind of a collusive relationship with the abuser. And I think a lot of that comes out of ignorance. So that's the first point I made, ignorance, in that pastors really don't know what abuse is a lot of times. And what I mean by that is when I have dialogue and conversations, it's rarely pastors looking the other way, although I have met some of those who, and I just think there's a level of wickedness to that. But a lot of times they don't know what abuse is. They think physical abuse. They think gross incident, like really dramatic, demonstrative incident, and education helps with that. If they can understand the dynamics, the impact, the significance of patterns to abuse. And then the second thing I think happens is fear. Pastors will function out of fear sometimes. And some of the things I've heard is fear of propagating divorce or some kind of slippery slope. Fear of false accusations. That's actually one that comes up a lot, although really that's an easy one to assuage. There really isn't a whole lot of evidence that we're dealing with false accusations at a high level. In fact, I think 3 to 5% on the domestic violence side was the last number that I heard. And even with that, victims are so they're less likely to establish victimization, meaning victims are very eager, I shouldn't say eager, but they're very likely to assume guilt when confronted with things, and abusers are very likely to play the victim. It's a very upside down world. So I think fear of false accusations is part of it. And then what I just mentioned about the upside down nature of this, I would say a lot of pastors are really in over their head, and it's not necessarily, well, it's mostly for education's sake and experience sake. They're not encountering a high volume of this. They're coming in with some preconceived understandings of marriage and relationships, and they sometimes will personalize what they're seeing rather than being objective and listening. So I think fear and ignorance are some of the main reasons why ministers delay help, why they kind of drag their feet sometimes, or really misrepresent what's happening in front of them. And then occasionally you do have just the blatant ignoring and pretending, as the questioner puts it. And I think the response, obviously, to fear is love and courage. The response to ignorance is education and information. And then a response to the pretending, that is direct confrontation. That's wickedness, and it needs to be addressed immediately. Okay? Question 2 for today. At what point should a pastor or elder team confront an abuser specifically about his abusive actions? And then the example is, quote, you did A and it is abusive because blank, or you did B and it is abusive because blank, and so on. So it's a very specific question. So let's deal with the second part first, okay? So the questioner gives an example of confrontation that is a little specific, right? So you did A, you did this action, and it's abusive because. I don't know that I've ever done, maybe I have, I've done few like this. I would say the vast majority of interventions that I've been a part of do not have the you did this and here's why it's abusive, for a very strategic reason. I find that if I confront an abusive person and I tell them what they're doing that's wrong, it's actually much more likely for them to play me or go along to get along. And what I mean by that is if I said, you called your wife this horrible name and it's abusive because I'm doing all the thinking, is what I'm saying. I'm doing all the thinking, I'm doing all the work. I'm much more likely at interventions to ask questions, gather data, connect dots, get information, because I would much rather for him to say that self-awareness to come and him to say, well, that's abusive. I see that now. Because there's kind of an assumed conversation when I get involved about abuse. Let's go back to the first part of the question, which is at what point? So this is very important because I find a lot of well-meaning pastors and elders, good men who want to help, actually jumping the gun on this, meaning that they engage in confrontational ministry too quickly. So at what point should the pastor elder team confront the abuser? And I would say that should happen with victim consent, and it should happen following victim care and safety planning. So here's what I mean by that. There are times where you have to intervene immediately, all right? If I saw someone this Sunday morning attack their wife in the parking lot, I would have to intervene immediately. That would be that's a no-brainer for me. I would intervene immediately. If, however, I'm getting a disclosure a week later, 2 weeks later, or I've been in a counseling relationship and the victim, for many good reasons, all right, many good reasons, is not ready for her abuser to be confronted, I want to, within as much as I can, respect that. So at what point, that's really determined in conversations with the victim in most cases. Now there are some exceptions as I highlighted, but that's the overall consensus. I want to work with the victim. And then the specific confrontation, I think that can happen, that happens quickly once the intervention's conducted. I would probably just use a different strategy is all I'm saying. Rather than you did, you punched the wall, you kicked the dog, you pulled her hair. I'm more likely, and so I'll just lay this out, maybe this will be helpful. I'm more likely to take the victim's input and use that to craft my questions and help construct the narrative in conversation. And here's why. This is why I think it could be really dangerous to tell him everything I know, because it could put the victim in more danger. Again, I'm still thinking, have we got permission from the victim? Do we have her consent? Does she know what we're talking about? So I'm not likely to just go in guns blazing. I'm much more likely to craft my questions in such a way to get disclosures from him. And once I get disclosures from him, it really helps build that case, and then really helps me teach dynamics and impact to him. I hope that's making sense. If you want more clarity on that, I'll tell you a resource is coming out next month that I think is going to illustrate that better than I can in a quick Q&A session. And that is from IBCD. The Institute of Biblical Counseling and Discipleship is releasing observation videos next month. Those observation videos are on domestic abuse, and it features myself as the counselor, Jeremy Pierre from Southern Seminary as the counselee, Joy Forrest as the advocate, Craig Marshall as the pastor, and Darcy Marshall as the victim. And I think it does a really good job laying what I'm saying out. So throughout that, Joy would, for instance, as the advocate, give me information that would help me craft my confrontation, because I just want to be really aware of her safety. I hope that helps. I know it didn't really answer the specific question. You want victim consent, you want safety planning to be in place, and then you want to construct your intervention in such a way and confrontation that makes safety a priority. So it looks like question 3 is a subset, like an extra to question 2. Do you have any advice on how to do this without provoking the abuser? So that's kind of what I was trying to lay out. Maybe I should have read these before I turned the camera on. How about that? Any advice on how to do this without provoking the abuser? So I think that's kind of why safety planning preparation is so important, and why victim consent is so important in this. Some other things that we can do, I often think of confrontational ministry through the lens of Galatians 6. I've really been chewing on this a lot lately, teaching this in different places, having conversations about this. In Galatians 6, starting in verse 1, Paul says, brothers and sisters, if any of you is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual, restore such a one. And so confronting sin is the context of Galatians 6:1. The people responsible to confront sin are spiritually mature. So we're supposed to be, the confronters are supposed to be spiritual in that regard. He goes on to say to do that confrontation with a spirit of gentleness. And so gentleness is actually something I promote highly among the people that I train and work with. And it's somewhat counterintuitive to what a confronter, what their heart is saying. An example of that would be when I first started in this work, I had a advocate who was not happy with me because my approach to guys was not aggressive. It was not demeaning. She really seemed, I think she wanted me to be really stoic and serious. And her take on it was I was part of the punitive response. And she even said in the evaluation, these guys are here to be punished. And I disagreed. I don't think a punitive response wins anyone. I don't think it does any good. I think it actually reinforces the worldview. So if I bully the bully, right, if I do things in provocative ways in my intervention, I really think that just proves the point. If I can overpower him, then it just reinforces the worldview that power is the priority, and if you abuse it, you can get what you want. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not firm. That doesn't mean that I don't stand my ground. In fact, I know this is turning into a big commercial for the IBC observations, but I think that was one thing I learned because I've never watched myself counsel an abusive person. I think I do the best that I can. I pray that I'm faithful, but this was an opportunity for me to kind of see myself do that. And I think I stand my ground in most cases. And that's really the goal, is to remain gentle, to remain winsome, but to be firm, not to give in, to remain in control. So that's an important aspect. Paul goes on to say that we reap what we sow. Okay, so I'm not responsible for that person's outcome. They still have consequences, so I can't assuage that. And then lastly, if I do my work well, Galatians 6 says I shouldn't be weary in doing good, because in due season we'll reap a harvest if we faint not. I think the harvest is referring back to chapter 5, which is the fruit of the Spirit, and that we're confronting somebody engaged in the works of the flesh in the hope that they'll surrender, repent, and embrace the fruit of the Spirit. But of course, to do that, we want to do it in a way that isn't necessarily provocative, although the gospel's offensive. So be prepared in confrontation to have people upset, angered, super frustrated. Okay, so do I have any advice on how to do this without provoking the abuser? No, I think remaining gentle, remaining winsome, remaining firm, and then understand that just your defense of the victim, just your focus on safety, just your centrality of Christ and the focus on the gospel will be provocative. That's why interventions increase risk to victims, which is why in the first part of the question, I really highlighted the importance of safety. Because when we engage in confrontational ministry, the risk to the victim, or the idea of escalation, increases. So we want to make sure our safety planning is spot on as much as we can. And remember, there's no perfect intervention, right? So it's aim small, miss small. We're going to narrow that down, get our safety planning as well as we can, and then pursue according to the victim's wishes and the gospel. Okay. And then it looks like one just popped up. Question just popped up in the chat. So let me see. This says, what would you say to a psychologist being consulted to treat children who share time between their abusive father and survivor mother? So this scenario is pretty common. Domestic violence, even criminal domestic violence to a large degree, doesn't necessarily affect custody in most cases. Like, this is one of those really sad realities of how the system fails. So let's say share time between their abusive father or survivor mother without meeting with the children, only speaking to both parents. Psychologist thinks it's a co-parenting issue, and that the violent behavior the 10-year-old son is exhibiting and other trauma behaviors with other children will improve once the households are functioning the same. What could the survivor say or ask in this situation? I would seek a second opinion if possible, or I would talk to my guardian ad litem if I had one of those, or a social worker that's responsible for the custody case, if that's an option. Because I think what's happening here, I think the psychologist is diagnosing based upon input from both parties. Now, one thing you could say to the psychologist during your session, if it's appropriate, is if there's criminality, if you have history of criminal activity or past civil orders, you could bring that to their attention. At least that would be a paper trail that would perhaps help the psychologist see what's happening. Otherwise, I would contact my support system, especially if you have some in the custody issue, such as a court-provided advocate or guardian ad litem, or somebody who's working with if there's supervised visitation or anything like that. I would reach out and get advice on that. I think you are justified in the concern, because it's if we're talking about domestic violence, then I think you've attributed it well, that some of these behaviors, especially the aggression being exhibited by the 10-year-old boy, could be trauma related, and so you're going to want trauma informed care in that. So I think there would be wisdom in seeking a second opinion. So that foils that. So the comment pops up, this psychologist was chosen by the gal, by the guardian ad litem. It may still be worthwhile to have that discussion. And then, of course, I would go back to is there a paper trail or paperwork that could substantiate your conversation? And the reason why I bring up paperwork is in these custody cases, it is possible people are biased, people are human. The psychologist may tune you out. And I hate to be so mean or rude. It's just the reality of the world we live in. He or she may tune you out if you claim abuse now, if it's new information. Hopefully it's not. But yeah, if at all possible, I would request another evaluation. But otherwise, unfortunately, this is a common occurrence. I wish it wasn't, gang, but it is. Oh, and Rosanna beat me to the punch. This is true. Co-parenting with an abuser, so an individual who remains abusive, and if you remain the target. Now, sometimes I have seen divorces end and that person no longer be the target. Unfortunately, sometimes the children become the target, or the abuser moves on to a new victim, or there is a law. But if you're still the target, if he still considers you the enemy and continues to try to use power to control, then obviously the kids could be a weapon or a tool. So yeah, I would continue to seek out other options if possible. And I wish we had the magic wand for situations like that. I've got a fourth question, which actually be our fifth question, considering I jumped over to the chat. We might take a little longer today. I don't know, gang. I'm feeling froggy. So if you have a question, you can pop it in the chat box too. But how do you effectively communicate to church leadership how domestic abuse is distinct from other sins? Oh, this is a great question. Or issues such as homelessness, abortion, drug addiction, illness, etc. This is a roadblock I'm experiencing right now. Good. I'm glad to have the question. I'm not glad you're experiencing a roadblock. You should not be experiencing a roadblock. However, there is this common misconception still floating around the church, and we have all heard it. I mean, we all grew up with it, right? Sin is sin, and the reason why we say sin is there really is a grossness to sin. There's a sinfulness to sin. We want people to understand that sin is not mistakes, that it's rebellion and violation against God's commands. And so we've kind of leveled the playing field, like all sin is sin. And while there's truth in that, there's also some nuance that needs to be added. Abuse is a very unique and distinct form of sin. And the reason why I say that is there's a level of hardness of heart and power that makes abuse increasingly problematic when it comes to sin. And I'll give you a couple examples. A couple references back to those 2 points. So first, hardness of heart. There is a hardness to this sin that goes beyond normal confrontation. So sometimes in normal relationships, one partner sins against another. They're confronted. They quickly repent because they're sorrowful. In abuse, the sorrow is rarely present, especially godly sorrow. And it takes time, energy, effort to exhaust that, to draw that out, or to relate to the church leaders that this person's unrepentant or rebellious. And we can go into that at some future time. But back to the question. So it is a specific hardness of heart. Second, the aspect of power makes it distinct. And so when power is used to control, the Bible would refer to that kind of as a blanket term as oppression. And so God takes oppression incredibly serious. And so this idea that one person in power is pressing down on somebody who's vulnerable is a serious violation of God's law, and it's an affront to God's sovereignty. And so there's definitely a weight to this that pastors need to understand. So let's just take the examples that you've given. Homelessness, I'll be honest, there's a systemic aspect to homelessness, that pastors should confront. There's definitely an economic reality in our world that churches and pastors can affect, and we should be speaking against some of the sinfulness associated with power structures that promote homelessness or keep people dependent and in poverty. But I don't think that's what the question is referring to. We take homelessness serious and we reach out to the homeless, probably in this church. Why not victims? Okay. Same thing with addiction, mental illness, abortion, all serious aspects of our culture and society. Domestic abuse, probably in those examples, is most related, loosely related to homelessness, but probably mostly related to abortion. I guess a case could be made that the drug war affects drug addiction from a power over standpoint, but this idea of abortion may be the closest because you've got this power dynamic and play. So I think communicating, I would start with resources, and I wouldn't start with anything big. If your pastors are willing, and I might even approach them with, would you be willing to read one book on the subject? And I would start with Darby Strickland's booklets. I know I'd much rather say, hey, read my book, but I would start with Darby's. They're smaller, they're much easier to read. Becoming a church that cares, at churchcares.com might be a good resource to forward. I've been reading some reviews on Church Cares, and I found that a lot of pastors are very excited about the legal conversations and the child abuse conversations, and some of them are kind of glossing over on the domestic abuse conversation. So we still have a way to go. But yeah, I would talk about the weight of abuse, the significance of abuse, and then send them some videos, send them this video, if you can, share this with them. So just any resource that's easy to see, easy to digest, I would be promoting that if possible. Yep, let's take one more question. I'll go over to the comments for this one. Kathy says, where do you even begin to work toward changing the system that turns a blind eye towards children and allows the abuse to continue through legally sanctioned evil? I don't mean to be ugly. I don't think there's changing the system in that regard. This is awful. It happens. This is going to show kind of my theological hand too. I'm a two-kingdom guy. I think the kingdom of God that's our home. That's where we're from. We just happen to be living here in America or wherever you may be watching. And the kingdom of the world is the kingdom of the world. And I think the government, as much as it tries to do good things and as much as it tries to help people, the government is still a kingdom of the world. And so we should expect it to continue to fail us and to not be the hands and feet of Jesus. And I hate that. I really, really do. There is little we can do when the judge does what the judge does. So I would recommend a good attorney, and I hate to be that way, I guess, but that's just the reality of it. A good attorney, if possible. I would document any concerns that you have. Requests for supervised visitation sometimes will be granted, especially if there's a history of abuse, and that would allow other eyes on the interaction between the ex and the children. You can lobby to try to get legislation changed, but at the judiciary level, it's really, really, really difficult to see changes. And I know family court, I've jokingly said I never see anyone leave family court happy. Everyone's disappointed to some degree or another. I would pray. I think even now as I think about, what is it, Acts chapter 4, maybe, where they prayed about the rulers and just the evil of the power over dynamic and how Peter and John, had been taken into custody after healing the crippled man, or seeing the crippled man healed through the power of Jesus. And, their prayer turned back onto the sovereignty and the dominion of God, and the place where they prayed shook. And it's not comforting in the moment, but prayer is the first work, and maybe we can pray together. Maybe after we close out today, everyone can join us in solidarity to ask God to shake the ground where this person is living, to shake up the system. Because really, at the end of the day, He's sovereign over all. But there is a limit to what we as people can do. So I wish I had better answers, but that's my best attempt for right now. Well, guys, looking at the clock, we're a good bit over time, but that's fine. I was planning to take a little bit more time today. I do appreciate everybody that hops on for Open Door at 4. It's becoming one of my favorite times to hop on here and interact with you guys and serve in what little way that I can. If conversations like this are helpful, I want to encourage you to consider joining Peaceworks University. Peaceworks University is our online membership site, and we do this once a month for an extended period of time. We build on previous questions. The chat box is much fuller. It's just a lot of good interaction. I see a heart popping up, so hopefully that's an approval for Peaceworks University. You can find out more at chrismoles.org. It's a small monthly fee or a small annual fee to join the membership site. Also, another heads up, coming in October, Lord willing, we've set the deadline, so now it's just up to me to do the work. We'll be offering a free email-based workshop, Domestic Abuse and the Church, where we'll be covering just 4 aspects of how the church can become the safest place on the planet. And our hope is to get that out to pastors and ministry leaders so that they can be more engaged. All right, so back to one of those earlier questions, maybe that's a resource that you could send to your pastor. You can find out more about that by signing up for our weekly email update or checking back regularly at chrismoles.org, because we'll be putting some information up there. Okay, gang, it's been great interacting with you guys. I'm looking forward to seeing you on the internet and out and about. If you're anywhere near where I'll be speaking, be sure to, if you're there, come up and say hello. Check out what's happening at IBCD for the observation videos, the upcoming workshop on domestic abuse and the church, and Peaceworks University. All right, gang, thank you. Until next time, God bless.